Up next, we're going to have a conversation that's going to dive into quite a practical example of how do you structure an instrument that is familiar to commercial capital markets. So we're going to be talking about structuring an SDG bond. These are relatively new instruments, but built on the type of bond instruments that have a lot of familiarity. And we're going to look specifically at the example of an SDG bond in Uzbekistan. So joining us virtually, we have Matilda Dimovska, who's the UNDP Uzbekistan resident representative, and Alexander Wiese, who's the managing director and global head of biodiversity, food, and agriculture at Bankers Without Boundaries. So thank you both so much for joining us today. In 2021, the Uzbekistan government, along with Bankers Without Boundaries and UNDP, issued a sustainable Eurobond on the London Stock Exchange, about $870 million that will be spent on education, water management, health, green transportation, pollution control, management of natural resources, and green energy. I think I got most of those in there. So it's sort of a wide spectrum. And so I really want to turn to the two of you, and can you walk us through how was this bond designed? What sort of process did you have to go through to figure out, what does the government need to do to make this work? How do you figure out how you identify the right projects for this bond? And then how do you sort of do the financial piece of it to bring it to market? Great. Matilda, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, let me start. Greetings from Samarkand, in fact. And I start first, not only because I have a train to catch, but I think I start with a broader perspective. For me, this is a story of more broader of a systemic effort to shift the finance, public finance, towards a development-oriented finance system in Uzbekistan, SDG bond including in that. But very briefly about the context of Uzbekistan. It is a fast reforming country and transforming country, eager to liberalize the economy, eager to open and improve its international image. It is also a well-resourced country with a very good fiscal space, and a lot of lending is already happening. The reforms very ambitious. In general, they are people-centered, SDG-oriented, and speed and results matter, and for the people particularly, and are very much considered. But we see a lot of policies being adopted, therefore the coherence sometimes is questionable. A lot of strategies not always accompanied with financing behind them. So therefore the approach that we took was of course that we support this ambition reform agenda, but also address these challenges, these issues through using the financing as a vehicle. So we work very closely with the government and the IFS to shift the public and private finance towards the development, towards this development-oriented public finance. Our role was about providing options, examples, expertise from other countries, and in essence, equipping the partners, inspiring about new ways of doing the finance and helping them mobilize financing. Now, we started with looking into the integrated or building integrated financing framework to set the overall picture of the development of the financing framework, and particularly look deeper into the public finance management, which came with the two key points, that while the efficiency of the existing financial resources needs to be improved, new forms of public finance needs to be brought in, particularly having in mind the assessment that was done, development finance assessment, which indicated that the development needs are huge, like $6 billion per year US dollars SDG financing gap for the country. So therefore, we argued for two things: amplify work consistently on a public spending efficiency, effective governance, and doing business environment, but at the same time amplify it the financing existing resources with international ones. So we continued working on all of these aspects of the financing system, but also part of it was issuance of the SDG bond. Now, you've mentioned in 21, Uzbekistan made a very good start with part of that bond was issued also in Uzbek sums. And it attracted a lot of attention. It was oversubscribed, I think, 7 areas, SDG-related areas that you have already mentioned were part of the offer. Now, we have started the process with facilitating the exchange with other countries. We availed the expertise, as the previous speakers were saying, bring the examples, put forward the ideas, and we brought that from Mexico, from India, Sustainable Development Network. So cases of thematic bonds issuance we brought, but also we focused on working on putting in place SDG bonds framework, or that would on one side ensure alignment with the SDGs and the needs into the country, but at the same time laid down a foundation for a robust SDG impact monitoring system, transparency of the use, accountability of the proceeds, and so on.
Great. Well, maybe we can come back to talking a little bit about some of those systems and how you're helping sort of monitor the use of the bond in a minute. I want to bring Sasha into the conversation to talk a little bit about how it was structured. And then we can also talk a little bit about lessons learned, because you talked about in this bond building on sort of previous iterations, but would love to also hear from both of you about how you can sort of take this experience and is it replicable and in what sort of contexts. So Sasha, tell us a little bit about how you sort of helped bring this product to the market.
So at the end, being involved in structuring green and blue and SDG bonds in the past, I have to say, in Uzbekistan, we found quite an ideal situation. So first of all, there was quite a strong collaboration between UNDP, the Ministry of Finance, and the Public Debt Department, and ourselves on the structuring side. So the Deputy Finance Minister, Odilbek Isakov, he knew exactly what he wants to achieve with the issuance of the bond. And our work was just to write the bond framework and align the internal systems in order to make the bond happen. On the one side, we helped the Public Debt Department to write the bond framework and align the categories to previous expenditures and looking forward how the expenditures could be aligned to SDGs. On the other hand, we've done quite a lot of capacity building, not just to the Ministry of Finance, but to the all line ministries. And this is where the projects are coming from. So to create real sustainability, you need to make sure that the line ministries understand what an SDG bond is, kind of demystifying the whole structure. Once you get to the point they understand, then the project collection and the subsequent allocation and impact analysis is simpler and more straightforward. And this was like the main task. The financial instrument itself was relatively easy to issue into place. And as Matilda already said, part of the bond was in Uzbek sum, which was quite a novum. And in this case, we issued a twin tranche where we had one part being in US dollar and conventional bond, and one part being SDG bond in Uzbek sum. And this gives quite a lot of confidence to investors that the country will allocate in line with financing in SDGs in quite focused way.
And so for people who might not understand sort of what an SDG bond is or how the instrument works, can you explain that? Because it is a thematic bond, but even for some people that might be not the most clear thing. So tell us a little bit about what is the instrument and how does it work?
So an SDG bond is similar to a classic or traditional bond, but it's a use of proceeds bond. So it means that the proceeds from the bond can be only aligned to eligibility categories. In our case, there were 7 eligibility categories like access to education, access to healthcare, and others. And on top of that, what makes an SDG bond different to a green bond or a social bond is that you map certain SDG and SDG targets to these eligibility categories. Once this is done, then the Ministry of Finance and the Public Debt Department can allocate the money received from the proceeds of the bond issuance to specific projects, and they need to be aligned with the specific eligibility categories. 1 year after the issuance, there's the first issuance of the allocation and impact reporting, but the impact is compared to what's been promised in the bond framework. So there are certain KPIs and targets which are within the impact reporting, and the allocation shows where the money has been allocated across the country in different categories.
And if the sort of impact falls short of what was anticipated, or if you determine that funding wasn't spent towards one of these categories, are there consequences? Is there a problem with the bond? What's the impact of?
The SDG bonds are aligned with ICMA principles. For green bonds, ICMA principles for social bonds, and the SDG frameworks. The thing is, ICMA principles are voluntary principles, so it's not a regulation, so there's not an effect per se if a country fails to allocate in line with the framework. However, speaking to investors are ready to divest from certain bonds if they don't meet the criteria. And if you look into the recent wave of greenwashing and reviewing of portfolios, this is quite an important point. Yeah. And this is because we had on the other side the deputy finance minister, having spent 15 years of his life in the banking industry, he understood it well that aligning with the bond framework is quite crucial in order to get more investors in the future into the country.
Yeah. So Matilda, part of your role at UNDP is doing some of this impact monitoring and tracking of where some of this funding is going. Can you tell us how things are going so far, and sort of how you're doing that monitoring, how you're working with the government to sort of track where this money is going?
In fact, that relates to the previous point that Sasha was making. You know, the government was very clear from the very beginning that they want this to be successful, and they were in a clear understanding that the reporting will be very critical, because it's not in their interest to have it's in their interest to improve the image, not to damage it with not a lack of impact. So therefore, the issue was to set the strong, robust monitoring system from the very beginning, and to set the criteria in the selection of the projects, in fact. So the whole UN system was mobilized to help the government establish, as part of the framework, a selection criteria, impact criteria, that at the end will help monitor whether there is an input or not. Now, it's not a straightforward process, and of course it required a lot of capacity building throughout the country, throughout the institutions, because the projects are locally implemented. So it was a capacity building that we did to the institutions that they can credibly monitor and report at the end, and the report is very soon to be issued.
Great.
So it was systemic from the very beginning. That was what I wanted to stress.
Yeah. Well, we will keep an eye out for that report to see how things are going. Sasha, I want to come back to you. We have just about a minute left, but I want to ask you do you think we're going to see a lot more SDG bonds? Are you working on other ones right now? When should a country consider them? We already talked earlier about sort of growing indebtedness. So SDG bonds may be using those funds for a specific purpose, but it could add to the sort of debt burden of a country. So when should countries be considering these types of instruments? Do you think we'll sort of see more of them? What sort of growth trajectory do you expect?
So the investments into thematic bonds, and this includes SDG bonds, green bonds, and social bonds as well, and going forward, blue bonds, where we work on a set of guidance together with ICMA in order to make a certain framework to accelerate them. They will be quite important in the future. So especially within developing countries, issuing an SDG bond is a signal to the market that the government is improving transparency of the allocation process. And this is quite important, and that's why I think we've seen already three SDG bonds, at least, being issued globally. So I would expect having SDG bonds, sustainability bonds, being issued even more going forward. But key to success of issuing SDG bonds and other thematic bonds will be a capacity building for the ministries of finance in developing countries. And this is where we currently are lagging behind, and that's why it's not yet accelerating at scale.
Great. So Matilda, I'll come back to you for the last word, because capacity building is something that UNDP does a lot of. And I know that UNDP has developed these integrated national financing frameworks with a lot of countries. So how are you now, on the back of that, as UNDP, looking at doing that capacity building? What role do sort of SDG bonds play in how you're thinking about how countries can meet some of those development finance needs?
Well, first, I think it is a rather systemic effort. One cannot expect a successful bond if the whole system does not function properly. So one needs to make sure that the principles of transparency, participation into the fiscal financial system is there. So this is one important part on which we are working and building the system together so that the bond lands into a good environment. The second issue is in Uzbekistan, what we aim to build on already on the SDG bond. We have checked, as Sasha was saying, the framework is already can be used for the thematic green bonds. So as the government is proceeding with a number of initiatives on the green economy side, we are working, we are preparing to put in place a more thematic-oriented funds, and also some other help them put a blended finance mechanism to build to link the issues of green, of gender, and so on. So what we aim in sum is to build on the SDG frame and to continue building the capacity to focus on a very specific now concrete development issues, and thus bring the development to the finance, or vice versa.
Great. Well, Matilda and Sasha, thank you so much for joining us and for telling us a little bit more about this SDG bond.